Hello, my name is Linda, and I am a retired American history teacher, and this is DYK, or Did You Know? History and Things to Think About. Today's episode is going to be about booze, patriots, and traitors. Alcohol played in American history. So, are you ready for information and some entertainment or infotainment? Hi, and welcome to History for Today's Generations by a Boomer. Going back to early North American colonies, water was difficult to drink during this period in time. There were no water sanitation plants, no bottled water, believe it or not. The water was mostly nasty. As a colonist, you drank other sources of liquid, including beer, whiskey, rum, and alcoholic punches. Colonists are believed to have drank on the average of 8 ounces of alcohol in various beverages a day. Alcohol consumption was much higher than it is today. Historians believe that early Americans drank about 6 to 7 gallons of pure alcohol a year. And this is what pure alcohol. So, alcohol, a mix. So if you put these together and you drink it, we're going to only measure the alcohol, not ounces of other stuff that goes with it. So that's what we need about pure alcohol. In fact, they drank 3 times more than we do today. Today, we drink on the average of 2 gallons of pure alcohol a year. Establishments that served alcohol also played as a key place in the colonies. Taverns took on even greater importance during the Revolutionary War.
Now we have to hear the boasting from the Patriots of New England.
I think it's time to test your skills on the American colonies. So are you ready? Let's go. Hey-ho, let's go. Number 1, New York used to be known as A, New Hampshire, B, New Jersey, C, New Amsterdam, or D, New England. If you pick New Amsterdam, you're right as rain. The colony of New Netherland was established by the Dutch in 1624, and it grew to encompass all of present-day New York City, parts of Long Island, Connecticut, and New Jersey. A very successful settlement in the colony began actually in the southern tip of Manhattan Island, and it was christened New Amsterdam. To legitimize the Dutch claims, a man by the name of Peter Minuit allegedly purchased Manhattan in 1626 from the Indians for trinkets supposedly valued at $24.
As the story goes, Dutch leader Peter Minuit negotiated the purchase of Manhattan for $24 worth of beads. First, it wasn't beads. Well, it could have been, but it could have been anything. We don't know. But what we do know is that it was the equivalent of 60 Dutch guilders, and 60 guilders today is more like $1,000 than 24. Still not great, but better. Then there's the idea that it was sold. It's a misconception that Native Americans believed no man can own the land. But it's not clear whether the Dutch bought the land or just bought the right to share the land. Too bad the Lenape didn't know that European settlers weren't much for sharing. Lastly, there's the theory that it wasn't even the Lenape that made the agreement, but some other tribe on its way to Long Island. Thus, the tradition of taking advantage of immigrants fresh off the boat begins.
Number 2, Georgia, America's 13th colony, was founded for a certain group of people. Who were those people? Was it A, Puritans, B, Quakers, C, Pilgrims, or D, Debtors? If you pick Debtors, you're right on. Georgia was founded unlike any of the other colonies because, first of all, it was the last to be created. Georgia, in fact, was founded in 1733, 126 years after Jamestown was successfully planted by the English. A man by the name of James Oglethorpe. He believed in the innate goodness of human beings. So Oglethorpe asked King George for permissions to create this utopian experiment for the English citizen, imprisoned for debt. English prison population can be decreased, he tried to convince the king, but the king was not really interested until the king's advisors pointed out that, hey, you know what, such a colony in Georgia might provide defense for South Carolina rice plantations from Spanish Florida, create a buffer zone. So the king gave Oglethorpe his permission and a charter. All right, number 3. What was the name of the boundary that separated the middle colonies from the southern colonies? Was it A, Middle Southern Line, B, Mason-Dixon Line, C, the boundary, or D, James River? Did you pick Mason-Dixon Line? You are right as rain. In 1760, the British Crown became really annoyed with the fighting settlers at the border. Each colony claimed that the area between the 39th and 40th parallel was theirs. So, on October 18, 1767, 2 men by the name of Charles Mason, no, that's Manson. There we go. Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon complete their survey of the boundary between the colonies of Pennsylvania and Maryland, as well as the areas that will become the states of Delaware and West Virginia. The families of the Calverts and the Penns of Pennsylvania will pick up the tab for this survey. The Mason-Dixon line is going to settle the problem at 39 degrees 43 minutes latitude. The line was marked using stones with Pennsylvania crest on one side and Maryland's on the other. 20 years later, in the late 1700s, the states south of the Mason-Dixon line would begin arguing for the perpetuation of slavery in the new U.S., while north of the line hoped that it would phase out the ownership of human chattel. Number 4. Who was America named for? Was it A, Amerigo Vespucci, B, Giovanni Americus, C, Fernando Americo, or D, Made in America? Did you pick Amerigo Vespucci? Right as rain. Amerigo Vespucci was an Italian, very well educated, and he worked for a very wealthy Italian family, the Medicis, in Italy. He eventually is going to move to Spain, where he worked in the ship industry, and he wanted to be a sailor. So in 1499, Amerigo, he sets out where he thought was the West Indies or Asia, because that's what Christopher Columbus had said. On the voyage, he charts the stars and the plants and the natives he sees, and even found the Amazon River. So a year later, he returns to Spain. So in 1501, he sets sail again, this time not for Spain, but for Portugal, which he sails even further down the coast of South America. Vespucci began thinking, wait a minute, this is not Asia, it's a whole new continent. So he called it Mundus Novus, or New World. He started writing his findings and what he experienced and what he saw to his friend Lorenzo de' Medici. In 1503, Medici dies, and all the letters of his discoveries and the things that he saw were published, and the people all over Europe began reading it. Well, a German map maker by the name of Martin Waldseemüller, published a geographic book, and he names the southern hemisphere America in honor of Amerigo. It caught on in Europe, and the two new continents became known as North and South America. Number 5. England's first attempt to colonize in North America was A. Roanoke, North Carolina, B. Jamestown, Virginia, C. Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts, or D. Boston, Massachusetts. If you picked Roanoke, North Carolina, you are right as rain. The Roanoke colony is the first English settlement in the New World. It was founded by Sir Walter Raleigh in August of 1585. The sad is that they had an accident and they lost half of their provisions, and they knew that it wasn't going to work out with what provisions they had. So Sir Walter Raleigh gets back on the ship, sails back to England to get more supplies. In 1587, Raleigh sends another group of settlers under the leadership of a man by the name of John White. He is going to bring out about 100 more settlers. This time it's going to be a little different. It's going to have women and children. And in fact, one of the settlers is his daughter, who will end up having a child. So they land in Roanoke in July of 1587, and then they again are short of supplies. So White returns for more supplies in August of 1587. He goes back to England and leaving his daughter and his grandchild behind. White and the supply ships return in 1590, 3 years after they had left. England, in the meantime, had gotten into a war with the Spanish, and Queen Elizabeth needed all the English ships, so no other ships could go anywhere else but to protect England. When he got there, everyone had vanished. He could not find anyone. He did come across a tree with a carving of letters C-R-O. Then he found on a post of the colony's fortification was Croatoan carved into it. Well, he decided that they may have headed south to the Croatoan island. So they loaded up into the ship and they were going to head there to check it out. But a couple unfortunate things happened. One, that the anchor line snapped, and the other was bad weather. So the captain made the call to go back to England instead. 3 years later, John White dies, and he never gets back. He never gets to check out his theory. Nobody's ever found them. The colonists just disappeared. They didn't find bones. They didn't really find anything. In fact, a lot of people today believe that they were abducted by aliens. Archaeologists have been working on this mystery for so many years, and they find little hints here and there. In fact, the last hint was in 2011. If you're really interested in this mystery, in fact, this is one of the biggest mysteries we have in this country, there is a really cool YouTube video, which I'll leave the link down in the comments for you. So good. It's so well done. And it'll tell you the story of the lost colonists. So how was your colonial skills? Were they good? It's probably been a long time since you even thought about the 13 colonies. Early Americans consumed a variety of beers, ales, and ciders that they had enjoyed when they had lived across the Atlantic. Men, women, and children drank alcohol. Women and children usually drank what they called small beer. Small beers are the simplest beer you can make. It was brewed and fermented for a shorter time, and because of that, it only had 2 to 2.5% alcohol. Small beers had not only lower alcohol level, but not a strong flavor, so kids and women would drink it. Today, those beers would really taste sour to us. In fact, probably even all of their beers would taste sour to us.
All right, let's try this for real. I like that.
Today in Australia, Colonial Brewing Company still brews small ales. It is 3.5% alcohol content. Probably not sour though. There are porters and ales from England. Then when the Germans started to immigrate to the country, they brought along their lagers and pilsners, which are a little more popular even today. In the colonies, they would use wheat, barley, and rye to make their beers. They would even use dried pumpkin or squash. But it's not like the Starbucks pumpkin latte that we like in the fall with a little bit of whip and some nutmeg on top. No, it was to help fermentation. Colonials would also use spruce tips that come from spruce trees, and they would mix it with molasses. They would allow it to ferment. And in fact, this kind of beer was really critical in the Revolutionary War because it happened to have vitamin C in it also from the spruce tips. And this helped to prevent scurvy. Ciders were made from any kind of fruit they could find, apples, pears, peaches, that kind of thing. They were also lower in alcohol. Even Quakers were known to drink a little cider now and then, even though they were known as teetotalers. Wines from the old world would be like port from Portugal, that's the name port, and Madeira from the Portuguese Madeira Islands, which was George Washington's fave. The colonists tried to grow grapes, but at the time it didn't do well. But whiskey was the thing. In fact, Virginia produced a wonderful whiskey from rye. And today, Virginia is still known for their excellent rye whiskey. So as people move west, and this will be mostly after the Revolution, when people move west, they start planting corn. So a lot more of the whiskeys are going to be made from corn. Like Kentucky, for instance, their famous bourbon whiskey is mostly corn. The most popular liquor of the 18th and 19th centuries was rum. It was cheap and easy to produce. It was mostly produced in New England from the molasses and the sugar that came over from the Caribbean islands. Not only did the colonists drink at home and at work, which they were encouraged to, by the way, by their bosses, but they would go to social places, these taverns. They were the place where they drank, they discussed town problems and politics, and toasted whatever happened, good or bad, in their little town or their neighborhood. A baby being born, someone dying, someone getting a job, it didn't matter. That is a lot of how they drank, is with toasts. There are only a few of these colonial taverns that are left in the United States, so I want to take you on a tour. I want to start with City Tavern. It opened in 1773 and it had 5 levels. It included a kitchen, a bar room, 2 coffee rooms, and 3 dining rooms, and the second largest ballroom in the New World, 5 lodging rooms and servants' quarters. So it was quite big and luxurious. May of 1774, Paul Revere arrives at the tavern and announces that Parliament has closed the Boston Harbor. September to October in 1774, the tavern becomes an unofficial meeting place for the delegates of the First Continental Congress. Before and after their sessions in nearby Carpenter Hall, Adams, Richard Henry Lee, Washington, Jefferson, and Peyton Randolph, all very important founding fathers. From 1776 to 1777, the Continental and British troops used City Tavern to house prisoners of war and military court-martials. On July 4th, 1777, America's first 4th of July celebration was held, even before we won the war. In September 1787, after signing the Constitution, the delegates adjourned to where? City Tavern. In April of 1789, City Tavern hosts a banquet for George Washington as he passes through Philadelphia on his way to New York for his inauguration. inauguration as our first president of the United States. Unfortunately, in March of 1834, the roof caught fire and heavily damaged the tavern. 20 years later, in 1854, the building was torn down. In 1975, a historically accurate replication of the tavern was completed according to period images, written accounts, and insurance surveys. In 1976, the newly rebuilt tavern opens in time for the country's bicentennial. However, in late 2020, the City Tavern is permanently closed.
A Philadelphia tavern that sits on ground linked to our country's founding fathers is closing its doors after more than 2 decades in Old City. Chief proprietor Walter Stabe says City Tavern is shutting down. Stabe says months of slow business brought on by the pandemic forced them to close. City Tavern opened in 1976. Stabe, who took over in 1994, spoke to us about the difficulty of this decision.
I didn't want anybody to think that I just gave up. I didn't give up, but it's just there's so much at stake. And this pandemic hit hard.
According to the restaurant's website, the tavern was the unofficial meeting place of delegates to the First Continental Congress in 1774. The property is owned by the National Park Service.
How sad that the pandemic has affected even our historical sites. The next stop on our tour is the old 76 House and Tap in New York. Originally opened by the Dutch in 1686, it is the oldest restaurant in the United States, 335 years old. Washington visited it several times throughout the war when it was under American control. This bar is where Benedict Arnold made his deal with British officer John Andre to hand over West Point, which wasn't too far from there, to the British. He had been an asset to the Continental Army up until the time that he betrayed Washington. John Andre, even though dressed as a civilian, was caught by the Continental Army, and he confessed to George Washington at the old 76 House. Andre was then hanged as a spy up on the hill that wasn't too far from the tavern.
Guilty of espionage against America shall hereby be executed as a spy.
As for Benedict Arnold, he fled to the enemy side. He received a commission with the British Army and served in several minor engagements against the Americans. After the American victory, he went to England. He died in London on June 14, 1801. At the age of 60. In fact, there is a monument on the grounds of the Saratoga National Historic Park for Benedict Arnold's leg. Not the man, just his leg. It sits on the spot where Arnold fell wounded during the Battle of Freeman's Farm. He had just led a brilliant charge against the British. The leg was severely wounded. It was bleeding, and the leg was also pinned under Arnold's own horse. The leg survived the battle and the war. This is such an awesome story. The whole thing. In fact, you can watch how the taverns, the spies, and the traitors come together in a series called Turn on Netflix. So, on that note, next week we're going to look at the Declaration of Independence in honor of the 4th of July. Remember, learn something every day, exercise that brain of yours, and please take care of yourself. Goodbye for now, and peace out. Down, Gracie, down.